Full disclosure, I'm Robin Farzad.
Who would hold the Trump mantle? There are many people who align themselves with his politics and who seem to have ambitions at that level. I mean, I'd be curious to see what Ted Cruz does, Tom Cotton, etc. But do they have the personality to be as effective as Donald Trump? I think that is unclear. Do members of his family have political ambitions? I think it will be very interesting to see just how long the Republican Party remains the party of Trump, which it is now.
Sara Just, executive producer of PBS NewsHour on the never-ending 2020 election, the pandemic, the transition in Washington, and reinventing the nightly news overnight into a well-oiled remote work machine. Stay with us. Subscribe to Full Disclosure on NPR One, Spotify, and on Apple Podcasts at link fulldradio.com. We now air in the Beltway on WERA 96.7 FM, Sunday mornings at 11. Tune in. Joining me is Sara Just, executive producer of PBS NewsHour, which she joined in 2014 after 25 years at ABC News, more than half of which was spent on Nightline with Ted Koppel. How are you, Sara?
Doing well, Robin. Having gotten some sleep after the election marathon. Feeling better.
Well, to timestamp everything, we're more than a week removed from the 2020 presidential election, and the incumbent Donald Trump has since refused to concede in spite of states coming in and the AP calling it. And I know you guys had to walk a very delicate walk in the many evenings since. But I would like to kind of rewind it back and have you channel your inner Bill Belichick. I know you're a massive, Patriots fan, tragically. How did you roll up your sweatshirt sleeves 2 weeks ago and prepare the staff in the kind of the decision tree of the 1,000 different outcomes that we could have had?
Oh, that's an interesting analogy. Despite the Patriots' miserable win-loss record this year, really the NewsHour team has been working towards this all year, and planning and preparing. We're all, good producers are always planning for various potential outcomes in terms of how they our planning and our production would have to adjust. And so the election certainly is like no election I've ever covered or any of us has ever witnessed before. But for the NewsHour, the planning was very much the same. Reporting on events and planning for possible outcomes. So we spent a lot more time this year than we have in years past thinking about ballot counting and having legal experts consult with us around that. We spent a lot more time being transparent about how races are called with the Associated Press, is who we work with, and explaining that really than we have done in elections past, although the actual process wasn't very different. The biggest change, of course, this year was really the pandemic and the fact that so many of our staff was scattered and working remotely. We had a much, much smaller footprint in our studio, but it worked, and that's thanks to months of work that has gone on to making the NewsHour a mostly remote television production since March.
So the peculiar things, I remember watching the returns come in with my son on Tuesday night, and we warned him this is the first election that he's watching. Listen, you might not learn a lot tonight because, alas, so many of the ballots, millions of ballots came in via absentee method. We're in the throes of a pandemic. And indeed, you had what some people, including Bernie Sanders, warned about was this sort of red mirage. If you just pay attention to the day of votes, you're going to get one vibe Tuesday night and maybe even Wednesday morning. And that entire narrative, even though I think that word narrative should be shot into the sun and destroyed, that has changed in the week since as the absentee ballots have come in and you've seen the slow but sure gears of ballot counting turn.
It really depends on the state's laws. Some states like Pennsylvania couldn't start counting those ballots by their own state laws until election night. And so the early vote wasn't counted before their polls closed, whereas other states like Florida and Ohio were able to count their early vote earlier and make a call earlier. We tried to explain that to our audience through that night and in the many days ahead of time and that have followed, that really what we have in this country is our election is for nationwide office in the presidency, but our laws about how those ballots are counted, when, etc., are statewide, and so they're different. But so far we've not seen really any sign that those systems have failed. They've really worked as expected and as planned.
Sara, if we were having cocktail parties right now and gearing up for Thanksgiving and the holiday season and all the Christmas parties, I'm sure everybody would be buttonholing you and your staff and Lisa and your DC people and saying, again, how did the polls get it so wrong? And everybody's trying to do a mea culpa. I read something in The Economist magazine this morning, which had with more than a 90 degree of certainty outcome that Biden, when all said and done, would have more than 350 electoral votes. What is your answer to that? And how kind of hardened or jaundiced are you after what happened, not just in 2020, but in 2016?
I think all of us who study public opinion surveys are really having to take a step back to look at the situation. Obviously, a lot of what the pollsters had measured has turned out to be the case. Biden has won by a large margin in the popular vote. That's what the national polls represent. In the statewide polls, some have been far less reliable, many. And I think that there's going to be a real examination, even more so than in 2016, about what is it about today's electorate that makes it hard to poll? Is it that people don't want to answer the phones or do the surveys online, et cetera, that pollsters put out there? Are there too many? I get random spam phone calls from pollsters too, and I'm sometimes hesitant to. Sometimes they're about commercial things, et cetera. You don't want to answer them, or is there something about voters who? And how they answer, their transparency, or how they're reached, if they're reached. I think that's going to have to be studied. And I think for a lot of public opinion survey work, social science that follows out of it, there's a lot to be learned. And I think we're just digging into that now. But certainly it is telling that that many of the polls did not hold up, but some did. Many did. So it's really trying to parse what was the difference, what were the factors that made some polls less reliable and some polls more reliable.
Of all the results that have come in the week plus since, pro forma, certain or otherwise, which particularly stand out to you or really surprise you that you did not prepare for, you did not model for?
For the outcome, you mean?
Outcomes, any state, any individual candidate, an extent, a margin, maybe something that happened in the House. Give you an idea, I'm blindsided by what happened in Maine. You were led to believe that it was fait accompli that Susan Collins was going to lose her seat as the senator in Maine. She was really controversial after the Kavanaugh confirmation. She had a super well-funded Democratic competitor, and even though that state overwhelmingly went for Biden, maybe with one electoral vote breaking off for Trump, people did split their tickets for Susan Collins.
Yeah, I think that, in a way, I don't find Maine quite as surprising because you do have this really remarkable red and blue split in that state. The northern kind of western part of the state is so much more red than the southern eastern part of the state. I thought the most surprising one was Jamie Harrison's dramatic loss in South Carolina. There was to Lindsey Graham. The polls were not showing that in those statewide polls. And I think, as I mentioned, we do have to dig into what is it about the polling in that state that made it not reflect what the outcome was. And also, there was so much money. Jamie Harrison overspent Lindsey Graham by so much, and yet it was not even anywhere close. On the other hand, I don't think it's really a surprise that South Carolina has sent a Republican senator and a well-known incumbent back to Washington. But Jamie Harrison did seem like he was competing more in the days, if you were to believe the public opinion polls beforehand. And certainly he was all over the airwaves and that kind of thing. But, South Carolina is staunchly red and sent Lindsey Graham back to Washington. But it was interesting to see that one, I thought.
So I'm assuming you were at ABC's Nightline during the 1992 election when Ross Perot was running and Bill Clinton took an unlikely chunk of southern states, including Georgia, and winning that plurality. And it was somewhat of an upset against the incumbent, George Bush 41. What's kind of similar here? Did you expect Georgia to come out in the way that it did? And of course, that hasn't been officialized yet by maybe some of the people you are tracking. But when and if Biden gets the votes in Georgia, that will be the first time since Clinton won it in 92?
Right. I mean, I do remember that race very well. It was really the first presidential race I covered for a national outlet, and the obviously, the big difference there was the third-party candidate and the degree to which that made a difference in that race, and also that a Southerner was running at that time. And so I think one of the, there are a lot of circumstances that are different, but one of the things that makes our understanding of a place like Georgia so different today is the way that demographics have changed in that state. And it has changed in many southern states. I mean, look at Texas. The demographics for a more diverse electorate are changing. And for the Republicans who turned out white voters largely, that is something to think about for the future. But certainly Georgia has, I think before the election, a lot of us cynical reporters were saying, well, Georgia's never going to go blue. Texas is never going to go blue. Texas did not. Florida, is the perennial swing, but has now for 3 cycles gone red. I think that or more the cycles has gone red. The Georgia is the surprise. And I think that is going to be really interesting to see how that plays out in the very close Senate races still to come.
I have to ask you, did North Carolina surprise you as well? Because the polling certainly suggested that it was doable not just for Biden to win that state. I think Obama won it the first go around in 2008, but that it would have been a Senate pickup as well. And even though I don't know if the AP has called it officially since, there's still some counting going on, but it wasn't all that close for Biden in the end.
It's hard to say which way that's going right now in North Carolina. Virginia certainly, was more purple and sometimes red for many years, and now seems to be firmly in the Democrats' column, in the blue column at the presidential race. And so that's going to be really interesting to see in North Carolina if there's movement there. I think Democrats had hoped for that this year. Democrats had hoped that North Carolina would be more purple. But if the demographics are changing there or the mood is changing there, it hasn't changed enough to move the needle on big Senate race, apparently, or the presidential race. Although at this time that we're talking, it's not fully called.
And then finally on Arizona. That was something that was really a bee kind of in the White House's bonnet that night that Fox News called it for Arizona. But it's a pretty big victory if you consider the Senate gain there, and that this at least changed the momentum story for Biden on the night of the election, the week of the election.
Right. Arizona is fascinating. And I think one of the things that we will have to see in Arizona in the 2022 midterms or 2024 presidential races, whether or not Arizona has indeed turned purple and blue, or whether or not, with the Senator Mark Kelly now being elected there as a Democrat as well as the presidential race going to Biden, was this about party or was this about Donald Trump? Was this an anti-Trump vote in Arizona and pro, Mark Kelly, who was a popular candidate there? In Arizona, of course, we saw Cindy McCain, the wife of the late Senator John McCain from Arizona, campaigning for Joe Biden, for Mark Kelly, and and all the criticism the president had of the beloved former senator there, late Senator John McCain. It's unclear whether or not those factors or there are kind of Trump factors are going on in Arizona, or whether or not there's really a change in demographics.
And before we leave Georgia, which is still hotly contested, you're getting a manual recount by the Secretary of State there. But there are going to be 2 Senate runoffs. And indeed, at least in theory, control of the Senate could be determined by these 2 elections in early January. How much money do you think is going to be plowed into that system? What is the lesson from the money that didn't work in Maine, in South Carolina, in Kentucky, maybe in Texas? And what are your predictions? Do the Democrats really have a chance of taking the momentum, assume the Electoral College victory holds, and channeling that into an unlikely kind of off-season victory?
Well, it's certainly going to be a good story. And as journalists, that's what we always want. It's going to be a good story. And it's probably a really good time to own a local television or radio station in the state of Georgia. You're going to be flooded with ad dollars. And so that is going to be fascinating to watch. But as we saw in the races you mentioned, just ad dollars alone are not enough to win elections, certainly in this climate and maybe even in the pandemic. Getting the vote out, and Stacey Abrams in Georgia has been really effective in changing the dynamics there, it seems, with that effort. And we'll see how much that happens. I think both parties are going to be incredibly motivated to get out the vote in that state for both of those races, because control of the Senate hangs in the balance. And we've never seen races really this late in the cycle affecting the outcome of party control. So it's going to be just fascinating. Again, Georgia's been pretty red for a long time, so I think Democrats have an uphill battle, but it'll be very interesting to see.
Full disclosure, I'm Robin Farzad. You are listening to Sara Just, executive producer of PBS NewsHour, where you've been for 6 years after a quarter century at ABC News, 17 years of which were spent on Nightline with Ted Koppel. And by way of disclosure, I learned English substantially watching Nightline with my parents 40 years ago when it covered the hostage crisis. So props to Ted Koppel. I'm sure you guys are still in touch. Tell me about the role that Donald Trump still plays. I mean, he did take more than 70 million popular votes. He does have political capital coming out of this. He's someone who's always parlayed whatever vote count he got or whatever inauguration attendance he did get into a bigger number. That's part of his reputation, his marketing reputation. What can he and he cannot do after the interregnum? I mean, for example, are congressmen afraid that he's going to primary against them in 2022 or 2024 if they don't come out and support this backlash right now?
Yeah, it's going to be fascinating to see. We've not seen, former presidents often are less political or go into complete, non-political territory for a good period of time and don't criticize their successor. I think it's fair to say no one expects that from Donald Trump. But how influential he'll remain after this really, staggering loss after one term as president it remains to be seen. I think what we're seeing right now with Republican senators, especially so few of them willing to acknowledge that Joe Biden is the president-elect and that Donald Trump does not have a legitimate path to overturning those results, from any of the evidence we've seen so far anyway, is a measure of how much there is concern that Donald Trump's sway with the Republican loyal voters will remain. This is going to be so fascinating to see in the coming elections, and whether or not, for instance, even Donald Trump runs again. If he loses, remember, constitutionally, he can run again in 2024. He will be 78 years old, but that's quite old to run for president, but that's Joe Biden's age. So it's not out of the realm of possibilities. Unusual. We've never seen really anything recently in recent American history about that. But it could happen. And then there will be questions about how influential he remains. There's some speculation that he might try to run his own television station, media network. There's some, question about who would hold the Trump mantle. There are many people who align themselves with his politics and who seem to have ambitions at that level. I mean, I'd be curious to see what Ted Cruz does, Tom Cotton, etc. But do they have the personality to be as effective as Donald Trump? I think that is unclear. Do members of his family have political ambitions? I think it will be very interesting to see just how long the Republican Party remains the party of Trump, which it is now.
And what is Joe Biden, assuming he's president-elect, and we are using the term president-elect now, what is his political capital? After all, his party loses seats in the House, which was largely unexpected. The outcome of them maybe taking back the Senate by 1 or 2 seats did not happen. You had Donald Trump and the Republican Senate install a third Supreme Court appointee from that administration. What can he do coming into his first 100 days? If you think back to Trump, he had the Senate and the House. If you think back to Obama in 2008, people who are elected, especially these change candidates, come in with that congressional mandate that Biden doesn't seem to have now.
It is a different kind of mandate. Certainly, winning the White House is a massive political victory for any party. The way we've seen over the last several years is with so much of it has been gridlock, or so much of it has been a Congress that has a hard time getting anything done in a bipartisan way, that the executive branch has become even more powerful. So certainly that is a factor and will be. But I think one of the things that would be interesting to see is the degree to which Joe Biden, who has, campaigned on the fact that he has been a compromiser when he was in the Senate. He has worked with people across the aisle and in many ways and tried to bridge divisions within his own party, which are going to be significant to watch as well. That has been a strength of his career, and that he has touted and his followers have touted. But it's a question really now in this political climate, how effective can he be at that? That will be fascinating to see.
Now, Abigail Spanberger, the Democratic Congresswoman, she's my Congresswoman here in the Virginia 7th. You saw the audio. You heard the audio that leaked with her call following the House losses by the Democratic Party. There seems to be this idea out there that it's kind of the Spanbergerian worldview versus the AOC and Squad worldview, where the latter is saying you really need to not take your base for granted. African Americans, women of color, minorities overwhelmingly put this president-elect over the hump, where Spanberger is saying we need to vanquish the word socialist from our vocabulary. You can't be talking about defunding the police. It seems to be a kind of an incipient battle for the Biden administration's mindshare.
I think it's going to be really interesting. Both parties are facing a real moment of figuring out what they want to stand for, which parts of their party are more powerful. What Spanberger said was interesting. I also thought Senator Clyburn in South Carolina Congressman Clyburn gave an interesting interview earlier this week and talked about that as well. Obviously, still smarting from the loss in that state for Senate, and knowing that is going to be not easy to to address. He was really pushing back at the idea of some of the more progressive voices being more influential. He was very concerned about the influence of the defund the police movement, it seems, and so, or what that statement or what that slogan meant for voters and who it turned off and who it engaged. And I think that's a really interesting, he's a majority whip. He's an important voice in the party, and certainly nobody's idea of a conservative Democrat, but he's practical, and so he's raising those alarm bells. And so I think we're going to see both parties looking at themselves and their priorities, and Biden is going to have a challenge on his hands, as are Republicans, in terms of trying to keep the coalitions together.
Now, Sara Just, it'd be one thing if we'd be talking about this election kind of in a garden variety backdrop. I don't even know if that metaphor makes sense, but we are, of course, in the throes of this unprecedented kind of once in 100-year pandemic. We have 10.5 million cases in the United States, 240,000 deaths, 52 million cases worldwide. The flare-ups are pretty shocking if you look regionally what's happening now. The New York Times is reporting today that U.S. hospitalizations top 61,000, which is a record, and state leaders are urging residents to stay home ahead of holiday time and holiday travel, and people may be coming back from college. This is certainly no playbook for understanding, and this is all happening while the General Services Administration is refusing to hand the keys of transition over to the Biden people, even though Biden has now picked out some of his point people on the COVID response team. What's your take, and what else are you hearing that we should be paying attention to?
Well, certainly the pandemic is hitting, again, just numbers that are staggering and so tragic. And there's certainly fatigue to the lockdowns and frustration, and it's become a political thing. If Joe Biden has said that he would impose stronger measures to try to beat back the pandemic, I think it's unclear how much that will be followed, and in some places in the country. And so I think that'll be really interesting to see, but it's concerning. I think all of us, every one of us, has decisions to make. I know I do in my family in terms of holidays and seeing family, et cetera. It's painful. But the degree to which that has been impacting politics has been so interesting. We saw in the public voter surveys that the AP did that of people who voted that the pandemic was listed as a much bigger issue for Democrats who voted than for Republicans. And so, how this plays out politically will be interesting to see, but there's no question we're facing a monumental challenge in the months ahead as these hospitalizations spike and infection rate spikes. I was just reading today that 1 in 1,500 people in South Dakota is in the hospital with COVID. I mean, it's truly staggering and concerning. And so I think the country has been so focused on politics, but as that recedes, the focus on this pandemic and what can be done and who is suffering and how that can be addressed has got to come in sharper focus.
Sara, how is it a partisan issue? I'm not trying to be coy, but you would think it all boils down to self-preservation. And when you've seen members of your community and when you're at the very least, the annoyance of not being able to see family members or homeschooling is a very real reality. In spite of that, this in this environment in this year, we've been able to look at it as a kind of a blue versus red state issue.
Yeah, it's really stunning to see. I mean, mask wearing, is a public health measure, not a partisan issue, but has become one in many parts of the country. And we see it, you just go for a drive, from where you live, you might see a very different mask, willingness to wear masks, very different in different parts of the country, different communities, and with very different attitudes. If you walked into a store with a mask on, in some places you might get teased or mocked. Other stores would throw you out if you weren't wearing a mask. So I think that is where we are. It's partisan, it's cultural, it's sad, I think, as we look at it, because people are dying, but it's where we are.
And then another surreal headline that if you told me that, this would be the reality after the election, why the Affordable Care Act is back before the Supreme Court amid a pandemic, I'm seeing on the NewsHour website. Certain voters might be interested in why the Supreme Court is able to take this up again and what's left to litigate and what the alternative might be.
Yeah, it's fascinating. Well, there's been, litigation moves through the courts pretty glacially by and large. So this isn't a new item necessarily, that's related. The timeliness around the election isn't about the election so much, but it is the way that these cases move through the courts. And the Supreme Court sounded, at least from the questioning. I'm a Supreme Court geek myself, and I love the tea leaf reading of listening to them hear the arguments and then trying to interpret where that means they'll vote. It is not an exact science by any means, but I think a lot of reporters who cover the court far more closely all felt that there was a sense that they were not leaning towards overturning ACA in that case. But we'll have to see. There's been this has been hanging over this election, knowing that this case was on the docket all cycle. It didn't get as much of attention because there were so many other things to talk about. But it is kind of amazing that in the middle of the pandemic, that's what we're battling over. But the future of ACA is something that even if the court doesn't touch it now, is going to be very much on people's minds. Fewer and fewer people are covered by it. The rates are going up, and so I think that for Democrats as well as Republicans, it's an issue that is likely to draw attention.
But suppose the Republicans were to, basically hypothetically, they were successful in striking it down, and the opposition or severability or whatever other kind of boilerplate in there. What is the alternative? If you're assuming that this administration has another 1-2 months left on it, they never really put an alternative plan or something to replace the ACA forward. There's been a lot of talk about it, but somebody used the metaphor of the dog finally catching the truck, and then what?
I think it's. I think the reporting that we've seen is that there really isn't a momentum around that in the Senate. There's just not consensus about what the alternative would be, and that's why it has been in this limbo for so many years. What the alternative is very hard to see. Certainly, the Trump administration has been fighting to knock it down, which would include knocking down the protections of the very popular pre-existing conditions. And the president has said, an alternative would include protection for pre-existing conditions, but in what form? This is a really technical kind of thing, and it's why ACA was so hard to pass in the first place. Is how do you create a safety net in this country for health insurance and not and how do you cover that, and what are the costs? I think it is a very open question. What would the alternative be? But it doesn't seem like there's political momentum around really knocking it down now. It could change. That could change.
And to the extent that you are a self-proclaimed Supreme Court wonk, when and if does this court now with Amy Coney Barrett and the majority conservative justices take up Roe v. Wade? What mechanically would have to happen? Would a state have to would somebody have to sue if a state, for example, overreached on abortion restrictions?
Yes, it needs a case in order for the court to decide, as Amy Coney Barrett talked about in her confirmation hearing, that it's, the court does not just sit there and say, and now we declare this. They need a case. It needs to be to come up through the court system before them. And I don't think that in the near term that's coming, although I defer to more better Supreme Court geeks than me. But I think that is certainly a question for the coming years around the court. And there are advocates on both sides who are going to look for cases that would challenge the law on that. And I think we just have to see whether or not this court takes that up. They've taken up many other abortion-related issues, but not that challenge Roe specifically in a long time.
And I have to ask you, even if Joe Biden were to get the support of the two senators who would, potentially win Georgia in January, and then you get a tied Senate, and Kamala Harris would be the tie-breaking vote, so it's a very thin and delicate Senate that you could take for granted. Court packing and state packing seem to be off the table.
It does seem that way. I mean, I think to the Democrats who had dreams of that before the election, that was really only even a viable conversation, if it was even a viable conversation then, because it's such a dramatic move with a dramatic majority in the Senate. But it doesn't look like, even if those two Senate seats hold, that would be enough to make those kinds of changes.
Sara Just of the PBS NewsHour, take me internationally. I mean, certainly so much attention paid. This is, this White House has done a great job of keeping a tremendous amount of attention on the White House, for better or for worse. Your correspondents have felt it. They felt it face to face in the White House press room. But what is kind of being short shrifted internationally right now? Like, for example, that Hong Kong, let's say, this past year or two is kind of quietly, with all the other headlines that we've had, Hong Kong is now effectively its reabsorption by the Republic of China by China, by Beijing proper, has been accelerated by several years. But you're kind of competing for headlines in the news, whether it's the pandemic, whether it's Israel, whether it's Saudi Arabia, whether what you saw happen in the occupied territories and settlements last week. Everything else is kind of being backburnered or short shrifted while the world pays attention to this election and the pandemic.
If you're watching the PBS NewsHour, you will get a lot of that coverage. In fact, for tonight's program, we have a piece coming about Hong Kong, in fact, and I'm really proud of my colleagues who are on our foreign team for, and our many contributors around the world who report for the NewsHour, who have kept, we've continued to make room all through the election and for foreign coverage. There's been a hot war in Nagorno-Karabakh and many other parts of the world where important things are happening. So, and also the way the pandemic is playing out around the world is something that we've tried to pay close attention to. Countries that are doing it effectively, countries that are struggling, where the pandemic is flaring up has continued to be something we focus on. But yeah, you're right. Absolutely. In general, the oxygen in this country is very much focused on domestic politics, always are, but especially now. And I think one of the concerning things, and this is a little bit of, I don't want to be alarmist about it, but I think that it is to note that one of the conclusions of the 9/11 Commission was that with the lengthy delay in calling the 2000 election, that there was it was an opportunity for our enemies to do work, to do terrible things. And so I think that I think all the people that we've reported on in the Pentagon and intelligence community and State Department, et cetera, have their eye on that, say they have their eye on that, that is a concern. That the media attention is one thing, but the bigger concern is that the people who protect America for a living are on the ball, and we've not seen any sign that they've drifted. But sometimes bad actors will take a distracted period as an opportunity to make gains, and that's one thing we certainly are looking at, and always making room for on the PBS NewsHour's coverage of what's happening around the world. We are a really interesting country right now, but we are not the only country in the world by any means.
And it's been covered quite a bit in that you see the Dow Jones Industrial Average visiting 30,000, which would be shocking if I told you to start this year. And I run through this exercise with all of our guests. If we're at a New Year's Eve party and we're looking at the year ahead, well, you'd have this pandemic which shuts everything down. You have emptied malls, people not paying rents and everything. Home prices would shoot through the roof as there are construction shortages. The Dow Jones Industrial Average would hit 30,000, even as unemployment hit rates we haven't seen in decades. Some people are calling this a K-shaped recovery, and that the K, one leg of the K is going up and the other leg is going down. The kind of this bifurcation of the haves and the have-nots even further in the United States. To what extent are you guys covering this even more?
Absolutely. That is something that I think we are very interested in covering at the NewsHour, and that is the experience of people in this country, particularly in regards to the pandemic. Who is suffering more has been something we've wanted to focus on. Obviously, we've all sadly learned how much people of color have been more vulnerable to this pandemic, and communities of color as well as poor communities. We have a story on the program tonight about farm workers in the Coachella Valley, for instance, and the pandemic, and people who are providing the food that we all rely on in the food chain in this country are sometimes our most vulnerable populations. And so keeping an eye on that, shining a light on that. Yes, it's true. The stock market has been, kind of remarkable in light of all of these things. And so for a lot of Americans, they're not unemployed. They're not facing as many loved ones sick. There's 401ks are okay. It is important that we remind them that this country looks very different in very different places. But sadly, we're seeing, as the economy goes on and on, more businesses struggle, more businesses have layoffs. There is no PPP new round coming from Congress right now that will rescue that. It's very unclear, what's going to happen to the airline industry that employs so many Americans. And so this is a really critical time, and how long this recovery takes, I just don't think anyone has a timeline yet.
Full disclosure, I'm Robin Farzad. You're listening to Sara Just, executive producer of PBS NewsHour. You've been there, Sara, since 2014. After 25 years at ABC News, you spent a ton of time on Nightline with Ted Koppel. You've covered various presidential elections, and you were in the Washington bureau for ABC News. In the 10 or so minutes we have left with you, I'd love to turn it around and wonk out journalistically with you on where you were, how you contorted, what you had to do when you realized, let's say in mid-March, that this is serious. We're all homebound. Is there a playbook for you guys? Is there something you pull off the shelf, an emergency, break in case of emergency thing? If a pandemic hits, how do you keep putting out the nightly news? Tell us what was involved in that.
Oh, wow. Well, there was absolutely no playbook, no planning. This was on nobody's radar, I think, as a possibility. If you had asked me in January if, the majority of people who work on the PBS NewsHour could do it from their homes, I would have said absolutely not. We are a daily live, news program, and we need to be together. We've had very few in our shop people working from home prior to this, and now we have almost everybody working from home. We do have a core group of incredibly dedicated, wonderful producers and crew who come into the studio and make it possible for us to broadcast. But you can see on the air, Judy Woodruff and our correspondents are largely from home. It was in March. I mean, I can't even think about that period without laughing, because we were inventing completely new production models for ourselves, and talking to our, normally our competitors, our colleagues in the industry, saying, "How are you doing it? How are you doing it?" Because everybody was trying to figure out the right way to do this while producing the program every night. I jokingly refer to that as trying to tie your shoelaces while riding a bicycle. It was an intense time, and we made lots of changes. We would have daily meetings to just talk through what are we doing on the production side that we can tweak and move and change so it's better, looks better, sounds better. But I'm knock wood, or we're grateful we didn't go off the air. This is a technical feat that we've come up with a new model for producing live television, and did dozens of hours around the conventions and special coverage around the election, and all of it in this new model. It's thanks to my really creative colleagues, producers, engineers, everybody. Technicians at WETA, the station in Washington where NewsHour works, that our colleagues there and are in the NewsHour newsroom have been so creative in coming up with solutions that work. It's also thanks to the audience for understanding. I think all of us as television and media consuming viewers have been getting used to the idea you can have an interview with somebody on Skype. The picture might not be as crystal clear. The audio might not be as crystal clear. And sometimes it's far less than crystal clear. We're not happy about that, but we can make it work. And the audience, I think, is understanding. This is the sort of perfection of television production values, something that we obsess about in television and sometimes wonder if the audience really cares about. Now we know the audience is pretty understanding and forgiving. And so we do our very best, and we're doing it in a way, though, that's most importantly keeping our colleagues safe. And so that is our top priority.
Having said that, you still have to embed correspondence with the president or on Air Force One or people to be in the White House press office, albeit in a distanced way. I mean, there weren't conventions. Maybe that's a cost center that you didn't have to have this year to send an entire crew and set up there. The fact that everybody understood that at least much of this on the Democratic side was going to be done remotely. Has that helped with the kind of the learning curve of innovating the show digitally?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, luckily, our digital colleagues have been innovating for a long time. And a lot of the things that they, and because we're in public media, we don't have all the resources in the world that we might want. Our digital team was actually quite experienced at finding solutions. And so they've been really integral in, and Travis Daub, the head of our digital content, and Emily Carpeau, one of our senior producers, the two of them, along with as I mentioned, our engineers and crew, IT, everybody at WETA have been so creative in figuring this out. The conventions are a great example, Robin, I have to tell you, because conventions take months and months of planning. We had a very elaborate team for a year out, really planning our conventions, making site visits, talking to vendors, making contracts with vendors, and starting in March, bit by bit, we just started taking things off that table until there was essentially nothing left. We did conventions a very different way. I think it'll be really interesting to see whether or not conventions ever fully go back to the massive production that they have been. There were a lot of things about these virtual conventions that were really satisfying for the electorate and for the viewers. So it'll be really interesting to see. I do want to say just what you were saying about some of our reporters and producers are going on the road, are putting themselves in situations, like the White House, where there's been several breakouts. They're doing it like reporters often do. They're going to places that they know are risky because the story is important and telling the audience what is happening. Not all of it can be done by remote. And so I'm so grateful for all the reporters, ours and others, who are willing to do that, and who are taking those risks personally and are protecting themselves as best they can, but recognizing that there is risk. It's not the same really as the very courageous war correspondents over the years, but it is in that vein of recognizing risk, but doing everything possible to mitigate it, but tell the story.
So, Sarah, even if you were to snap your fingers tomorrow and have the vaccine and, full U.S. herd immunity and whatnot, you wouldn't necessarily go back to the old normal of scrambling a camera crew or sending them to the scene, committing budget and everything to do it now that it can be done in a leaner, faster, more cost-effective way. I mean, as you said, you had worried before that viewers would pillory you if they had to deal with Zoom too much, or if it kind of looked grainy. And we have learned, and all the other news organizations have learned. I mean, NPR has learned that this could be done at home, that you can do it in a way that you are going to get a fall off some of quality, but the velocity with which you can innovate and get stories and scrap things and not have to put people on planes is a lot faster.
Yeah, I think that's, there's some silver linings in this. And one of them is for instance, when we want to do a story and get reactions, say, from college students about, the pandemic or something else. In the past, we would send out camera crews. We'd pick one campus. We'd go there. We'd spend, several hours trying to convince lots of people to talk to us. Now we can get, voices from around the country, from multiple locations, with a social call out, asking people if they, will talk to us, what their point of view is, researching who they are, and be sure to identify them accurately, and then record an interview over the computer. In a few hours, we can get reaction and input on a wide variety of stories very quickly in a way that in the traditional model we couldn't. And so I think that will stay. I think largely that will stay, and is a great outcome. But, I have to say, as a journalist, what I miss most is the proximity of working together in the newsroom. And I think it's sad to see, some news organizations, I think it was the New York Daily News, announced that they were going to not renew their lease on their newsroom and continue in a model of working remotely. I think that is unfortunate. I think newsrooms need to exist in the future. The proximity of working with your colleagues, the serendipitous moments of overhearing a colleague who's working on one story and saying, hey, you know what, I know a source on that, let me help you, or I heard you working on that, let me recommend, did you see this article? All those kind of serendipitous opportunities, not to mention just the human interaction, as we all miss in every industry, that, checking in with your colleagues. Zoom calls that we all have all day long can feel very transactional. I called you because I need this information and you've given it to me now, thanks, goodbye. You miss the opportunities in the hallway. How's your mom? How are your kids? How you doing? That kind of stuff is the glue that makes news organizations and so many businesses work. And while we've all adjusted necessarily to the situation, I really look forward to returning to that. It may not be as many people, it may not look exactly the same under the one roof, but I do hope that newsrooms thrive in the very near future.
Sara, I have to ask you in a few minutes we have left, what is that handover going to look like? What is inauguration going to look like? What if this continues, this persists well into January, and you have Trump and his backers not accepting the outcome? If you have people show up, if it becomes, already if you look at Lafayette Park and the area around the White House, it's significantly cordoned off. I mean, you can't look back at Watergate and find an analog to this situation. There's no playbook for this.
No, but I do think that, the reporting we have is that so many groups have been confirming that they expect a smooth, peaceful transition and inauguration. Inauguration will look very different because of the pandemic, I think, is one really important factor that we'll have to see how that plays out. That'll be interesting to see. Do you have balls and so forth in a pandemic, or how many people would come to the mall and for an inaugural event? But I do think that at the end of the day, we'll see how these next few weeks, critical weeks, play out. But there's many people involved in that who are reassuring that a peaceful moment like that. We've never had a conflict at the transition of power point in this country. And I think many people who are responsible for that are saying that they don't expect that to happen this year either. But there's many things that have to play out between now and then, and certainly a lot of very concerning signs right now that we're not headed smoothly in that direction right now.
Close us out, Sara Just. Tell us about any new things in the offing at NewsHour, digital bells and whistles, side projects, interesting guests.
Oh, thanks, Robin. Well, for your audio listeners, I hope that you will also consider following the America Interrupted podcast that the PBS NewsHour produces. America Interrupted. You can get it wherever you hear your podcasts. It is a great listen from the PBS NewsHour newsroom. We've been covering lots of timely stories, mostly about the pandemic and how it has disrupted our lives. We have an episode coming up very soon about colleges and how they are adjusting to the pandemic. I have college-age kids. A lot of people are really concerned about what is this period of time mean for higher ed in this country? What kind of experience are college students having if they're mostly doing their courses online? And of course, what happens when a lot of them get on airplanes and in cars and come home at the Thanksgiving break? So we'll be looking at that starting next week on a new episode of America Interrupted, and many other great episodes there too.
Sara Just, I love your company. Please come back on.
Yeah, it's a pleasure, Robin. Thank you. And next time, I hope we'll be able to do it over delicious kebab lunch that we're long overdue for.
Oh, yes, in Northern Virginia and Persian food. Sara Just, executive producer of PBS NewsHour, veteran of ABC News, thank you so much for joining us.
It's a pleasure. Thank you.
Full disclosure, special thanks to my wonderful, trusty engineer, John Valentine. Subscribe on NPR One, Spotify, and on Apple Podcasts at link fulldradio.com. Again, we now air in much of Northern Virginia and in Washington, D.C. on WERA 96.7 FM. Sunday mornings at 11. Tune in. On Facebook and Twitter, we're at Full D Radio. You can direct message me. MP3, WAV, WFH, it's all good. I'm Robin Farzad. Back with you next week.